The end update is definitely on Mojang's roadmap. Empty, barren and just uninspiring, it needs an overhaul. Others have made great concepts of content that might be added to the end, but I want to tackle the fundamentals. And please watch until the end, this idea will justify itself once fully explained. And if my heavy accent is hard to understand, I provide captions. What if the end wouldn't be a physical dimension, like the overworld and the nether, but a rift in time and space where matter just can't exist? Except when it does. What if the end would be a dimension of chaos with occasional bubbles where matter can exist, populated with structures, vegetation, and various building materials? What I want to achieve is to keep the feel of the end being empty space, but not make it play like empty space, to eliminate aimless flights above nothingness from one city to another. Each bubble has at least one gateway which leads to other bubbles, and to activate a gateway you need to complete an objective presented by a bubble. For example, this bubble might require killing a mini-boss to open the gateway. This bubble requires you to haste the key from the end city. And this one has its gateway open, but is half buried. So, here is how it would play out in game. You enter the end, you beat the dragon, you enter a gateway that sends you into a bubble, you defeat the bubble and open a gateway that sends you into another bubble, which eventually forms a network of bubbles connected via one-way gateways. Because nothing can exist outside of these bubbles, it presumes that you cannot exist there as well. I'm not sure if the player taking damage there to prevent flying between bubbles is good game design, but that's how I envision it. But how do you get back? There are no dedicated backtrack gateways, but each gateway has a chance to send you back to an already existing bubble, including the central bubble with the overworld portal. This adds the risk-reward element to the end, because you never know how long it will take to get back, and if you'll even make it back, or die trying to conquer yet another bubble. At this point, it becomes a dungeon when you have to map out your journey, gather loot, defeat rooms, while hoping that you'll find an exit. But what if you could make an exit? For a price. What if you could use the new loot you find in the end to manually redirect a gateway to a desired bubble, which is probably one that eventually leads home? Now you have a choice of continuing forward until you find a random exit and keep all collected loot, or to sacrifice some loot to get out immediately. This opens another possibility. Remember when I said that the end won't be a dimension but a rift in time and space? Mojang liked to tie new features to the rest of the game. So, in spirit, what if you could redirect a gateway to send you to the overworld, but not to an arbitrary place in the overworld, but to an end portal in the overworld? And that end portal will be redirected to this gateway instead of the central island. This would require reworking how strongholds generate, because currently they don't generate far from 0-0. This will introduce long-distance travel, and by long, I mean hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of blocks. Because end portals are fixed landmarks, you still have to use other means of transportation in conjunction to get from the end portal to a specific point of interest. This long-distance travel network will synergize with existing transportation instead of replacing it. At this point, our concept has 3 benefits to the end. It keeps the feel of emptiness while not making the play empty. It makes the end a more risky and action-packed dungeon dimension, in place of a mundane shulker shell gathering dimension, and it introduces long-distance travel over the overworld and the end itself. But there are two additional benefits. You know how in multiplayer you have to go out for thousands of blocks just to find a single unraided end city. If the end is well explored in this concept, you'll quickly blaze through the conquered bubbles and it will take minutes at worst until you find a gateway that's unlit. Or you can redirect a gateway to an unexplored section of the end. End file size. The current end is likely to be the biggest dimension on your disk because when you travel through the end, it just goes on and on and on. All this nothingness takes space on your drive. But if there is nothing outside of the bubbles, there is nothing to generate and nothing to store. Let's explore how the bubbles work. Let's say the reason why a bubble can exist is an arcane crystal of sorts, and if you take it from one bubble and place it in another, it will increase the size of that bubble at the expense of the other island collapsing out of existence. Actually, no. It makes it just so easy to grief. And not just intentional griefing, vanilla isn't really concerned about that, but accidental griefing and accidental self-griefing. What if you take away a crystal from an island that's a part of someone else's base or someone else's travel chain, and you don't even know about it? For a similar reason, I've declined the idea of an island that has a time limit to conquer. The death ratio on this would be way too high. And besides, what do you do with gateways leading to a collapsed island? So, collapsing islands isn't an option, but I like the idea of being able to expand a bubble so that you can make a base in the end. How about a consumable loot item that expands the bubble size upon use? For the same reason, there shall be no way to decrease the bubble size, but why would you want it anyway? Sometimes people build bases in the end specifically to get as far away from people as possible. How can we bring that back? Because physical proximity became irrelevant in this concept. We can make it relevant again by having new bubbles generate in a local sector when you make a gateway jump. But if you would redirect a gateway, you can shoot a bubble millions of blocks away, connect that bubble with an obscure overworld location, and redirect the initial gateway somewhere else. Good luck accidentally finding that island. So, this is my concept. I deliberately didn't touch the blocks and items you could have with the end update, because this concept is open for pretty much anything. But of course it presumes that you need to add something worth exploring for, and that something shouldn't be something you would want to farm, because you want to have a reason for exploration, but you don't want technical-minded players to be forced to explore.